When you start engaging in history because you want to tell a story, you will naturally avoid, ignore, or discount anything that interferes with your story. This is the case with the story of Sarah Ann Whitney, or, according to the narrative, Sarah Ann Whitney Smith Kingsbury Kimball. For this one, I'm going to focus on Brian Hales' website, josephsmithspolygamy.org, a name as unsubtle as a punch in the face, but that's just the beginning. The website has a biography of Sarah Ann, with a heavy focus on her alleged involvement with polygamy as a plural wife of Joseph Smith. In the language of calm certainty, it lays out the plural marriage in 1842, the revelation that Joseph received directing Newell Whitney to perform the ceremony, the feelings of family and friends about the matter. We read of the letter Joseph wrote to Sarah Ann and her parents, longing for the company of his new wife, and Joseph's efforts to shield them both from scandal by asking Joseph Kingsbury to pretend to be her husband. It's a story told with such certainty that you could hardly doubt it, unless you happen to take a critical look at the sources. First, and perhaps most egregious, is what is referred to as a revelation that Joseph received to direct Newell Whitney to perform the ceremony, dated July 27, 1842. Although this document exists, the website commits a stunning lie of omission, concealing that this alleged revelation was first seen in 1912, when Orson Whitney gave a typescript copy to the church, although Orson claimed as early as 1885 that it existed. Subsequently, 2 manuscript copies were mysteriously found in the church's archives. No one knows who wrote them, or when, or who put them in the archives. Treating a typescript from 78 years after Joseph's death as if it was a contemporary document is dishonest. The only thing Sarah Ann ever said about her alleged plural marriage to Joseph was in 1869, when she signed an affidavit. Interestingly, the affidavit contains the statement that she was married to Joseph, quote, according to the laws of the church regulating marriage. The church's law of marriage in 1842 was found in Doctrine and Covenants 101, which said marriage ceremonies should be solemnized publicly, not privately as her alleged ceremony was, and specifically forbade polygamy. But the affidavit containing such an obvious error does not raise any red flags for polygamy apologists or LDS historians. Believe all women, even when they contradict themselves. There's also that letter that allegedly Joseph wrote to Newell, Elizabeth, and Sarah Ann Whitney. Despite that framing, the letter doesn't mention Sarah Ann at all. It refers to brother and sister Whitney and etc., and you three. Maybe Joseph meant Sarah Ann, and maybe he didn't. There's no clue in the letter, and certainly no indication that the third person is married to him. In fact, there's nothing except the framing of the polygamy story to make someone think that the third person is Sarah Ann. Then there's the pretended marriage to Joseph Kingsbury. There are contemporary records that Kingsbury and Sarah Ann were legally married by Joseph Smith on 29 April 1843, 9 months after she allegedly married Joseph. But the earliest source for it being a pretended marriage is Kingsbury's autobiography, often mislabeled as a diary, which he compiled between 1848 and 1864, after he was in Utah. Interestingly, Kingsbury says that he married Sarah Ann, quote, according to President Joseph Smith, counsel, and others. But his autobiography doesn't mention Joseph being married to Sarah Ann. Since he's writing in Utah after Joseph's death, there would be no reason to keep that a secret. Of course, when Kingsbury's granddaughter created a typescript copy of the autobiography, she took the liberty of updating it to the latest version of the story by adding the marriage of Joseph and Sarah Ann. Altering records is a disturbing trend with these people. To the credit of the polygamy website, it quotes Kingsbury's longhand copy rather than the doctored version. Another piece of Kingsbury evidence that is used to try to prove the story is what is termed a bill from Kingsbury to the church for his financial support of Sarah Ann. Again, the apologetic framing itself is deception. When most people think of a bill in this context, they think of an itemized list of charges. But what Kingsbury submitted is actually a request that his $8,000 debt to the church be remitted. Adjusting for inflation, that debt would be about $250,000 today, how in the mangled money did Kingsbury become $250,000 in debt to a church? This is far greater evidence of Kingsbury's bias and unreliability than it is of an alleged marriage 40 years earlier, but that doesn't occur to the polygamy apologists. The story goes that Heber Kimball married Sarah Ann on 17 March 1845, although I've not been able to find a primary source for this. The website says this ended her pretend marriage to Kingsbury, but Kingsbury records that Sarah Ann was living with him until May 1846, and there seem to be no records of a divorce. These dates don't seem to make sense either way. If Kingsbury was a front husband to protect the plural marriage, then why stay with Sarah for 2 years after Joseph's death? And if Heber married her in 1845, why did she keep living with Kingsbury for over a year? Kingsbury seems to be the only source for the marriage being a sham, and he apparently doesn't mention that the pretended marriage was to cover for Joseph until 1880. If we look at the facts, we see that Kingsbury and Sarah Ann were married in Nauvoo by Joseph, but with apparently no divorce and no remarriage ceremony. By the time they get to Utah, Sarah Ann is living with Heber Kimball. If you can find some evidence of an actual marriage between Kimball and Sarah Ann, please let me know. But Kingsbury is apparently Sarah Ann's only legal husband. Am I implying that Kingsbury invented the pretended marriage story to try to deal with the fact that Heber Kimball stole his wife? Or am I perhaps implying that there really was a sham marriage, but it was to protect Kimball's plural marriage to Sarah Ann? Well, I'm certainly not implying that, but with the dearth of evidence, we'll probably never know for sure. And when it comes to not knowing things for sure, the references from friends are at the top of the list. They not only come after Sarah Ann makes her affidavit, but after she's dead, a full 30+ years after the events in question. Included as evidence is the testimony of Orson Whitney, who is carefully touted as Sarah Ann's nephew to establish his credibility, who says that, quote, "This bond of affection between the Whitneys and Joseph Smith was strengthened and intensified," close, by the marriage to Sarah Ann. Of course, Orson could not have known that, since he wasn't born until 1855, 11 years after Joseph died. Also included is the testimony of Sidney Rigdon's son, John Rigdon, from 1904, that, quote, "In 1843 and 1844, it was the common talk of the members of the church. Joseph Smith married, at Nauvoo, Sarah Ann Whitney. John Rigdon was 13 in 1843. What a precocious boy to understand and remember such a scandalous fact." And isn't it odd that although Rigdon says that it was the common talk that Joseph married Sarah Ann, nobody said or wrote anything about it until 30 years later, and then they emphasized how secret it was? It's a fact of life that memories fade with time and change with recollection. So why are all these late reminiscences by people immersed in and dependent on a culture of polygamy not treated with the skepticism they deserve? Speaking of time, I think that it's particularly striking to arrange the sources in chronological order, not of the date of what they are talking about, but the date of their creation. Right away, a very different picture emerges than what the polygamy apologists put in their narrative. The first historical document mentioning that Joseph and Sarah Ann were married is Sarah's affidavit in 1869, 27 years after the alleged event. This is significant because Joseph Smith's sons had started visiting Utah in the 1860s to proclaim that their father had never practiced polygamy, which threatened the entire system. It was then that Sarah Ann, along with many other women who were wives of powerful Mormon leaders, started claiming that they had been married to Joseph. These women had everything to lose if they lost polygamy: money, security, family, status, and from their perspective, their souls. To say that makes them biased is putting it mildly, but their testimony is never critically examined. If it was, historians might recognize that it has all the markings of a story invented in dire need and growing afterwards. It's like I said at the beginning. When a person sets out to tell a story, they will warp the facts to fit their narrative. As we've seen, every single fact that josephsmithspolygamy.org uses to build the narrative about Sarah Ann is questionable at best. And contrary to what some people think, a large aggregation of poor evidence cannot be alchemized into good evidence. despite the efforts of the mountebanks who call themselves apologists and historians. At least, that's what I think. Tell me what you think in the comments below. Until next time, this is I Believe Joseph, signing off.